fáilte roimh go léir an sa tróna go háclan na manisteach agus an dara cheann de trí sympósia bliain túil nó bbliain túile. Líntóirí a cháirde, seo seansúing ar fad dulling lech a ríis le conas ar fiúdúing cuasaí staire, cuoinecháin agus drámaí a chur feh ráid ar ggóir saoránaigh. Artists, Abbey Theatre audiences, board members, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our second annual Theatre Symposium, the Theatre of War. This is the second of only 3 symposia, and it is our intellectual and artistic contribution to the themes and challenges of how artists should, if at all, contribute or respond to the decade of centenaries here in Ireland. This year's symposia is the continuation of our conversation of last January, so the themes of memory, fiction, and artistic strategies do relate to this year's theme of conflict, war, and the international stage. The stimulating challenge for all of us Irish people interested in our own history is how we might engage and reflect our memories of the past and our political and artistic engagement of the present in a broader and more international context. A modernist cri de coeur, perhaps, that our opening keynote speaker, Professor Luke Gibbons, will address. How should or can we view our national historical experiences through an international prism? I attended a conference back in June 2012 in the Royal Hospital Conghail, organised by the Universities Ireland, and heard the same cri de coeur from Professor Jay Winter when he stated that national exceptionalism is a thing of the past. This led me to research what else was happening globally in 1916, and this in turn brought me to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which some of you did history, as I did, and I was taught by Tony Gregory. He spent a lot of time on the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This carved up, essentially, what we now know as the Middle East, another legacy of that year, 1916, another centenary to acknowledge, perhaps. These factors have informed this year's symposium. Of course, it is not comprehensive, nor is it balanced. It is my attempt to seek out interesting and challenging artists and public intellectuals who could inspire, inform, and maybe provide ideas for future discussion and for making theatre. After all, we are a theatre company, first and foremost. The Abbey Theatre has been active on this very site for now over 110 years. Across time, the nature of conflicts around us has changed, while the theatre has retained a role as a forum for national conversation, and we look forward to continuing that tradition over the next 3 days. We have a packed 3 days, as Kelly has said to you, and with a keynote speaker every day. This year we have also had some extraordinary performances. If you have not seen Corinne Jabber in Oh My Sweet Land and the Peacock, you have until Saturday. But also we have a reading of Shibboleth by Belfast playwright Stacey Gregg. We have excerpts from War Correspondence, a song cycle created by Helen Chadwick. And we have Naomi Wallace and Ismail Khalidi's stage adaptation of Ghassan Kanafani's wonderful novel, Returning to Haifa, as well as artists from Rwanda, Palestine, Serbia, Ireland, England, Belgium, Belarus, the US, Sri Lanka. We welcome our international guests and artists with their stories, memories, and art from all corners of the world, both the living and the dead. I would like to thank all our staff and colleagues at the Abbey Theatre, also our partnership with the Ariadne Project, for their sustenance and support in presenting this year's symposium. My colleagues on the steering committee itself, and also our patron, Professor Declan Kybert. I wish to acknowledge the support of the Arts Council, our donors, and our audiences who support us and financially, and endorse us in what we do as a national theatre. So now to introduce Luke Gibbons. I was reminded that how we came up with the title Theatre of Memory last year was when Luke and I and many, many thousands of others were marching in Avondale protesting against their potential privatisation. of Cuilta. And I have to acknowledge publicly that you came up with the title Theatre of Memory, and thank you for that, Luke, and thank you for your support. Luke is Professor of Irish Literary and Culture Studies at Maynooth University and formerly taught at Dublin City University and the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. As a leading public intellectual in Ireland, he has published on a wide range of topics, from Irish cinema to Edmund Burke, Irish modernism and the visual arts. His most recent publication is Limits of the Visible, Representing the Great Hunger, and his forthcoming book, Joyce's Ghosts, Ireland, Modernism and Memory, ends on a note that strikes a chord with this conference, that there's always something left over from the past, and that is the future. I welcome Professor Luke Gibbons.
Thanks, Fiach, and thanks to Kelly and Aideen and Jan and the whole show, literally here, for putting this event together. I'll be saying something about how I conceive of the event later, but what I'm trying to do is to relate the Rising to the bigger picture of the international stage. When the Abbey Theatre staged Rabindranath Tagore play The Post Office in May 1913, few could have suspected that theatre itself might be upstaged within 3 years by a real-life production in another nearby post office. Lennox Robinson's production of Tagore's play was organised by W.B. Yeats, and indeed Coola Press published the play. It was organised as a fundraiser for the cash-strapped St. Enda's School in Rathfarnham. And as a double act, Yeats asked Patrick Pearse, the founder of St. Enda's, to stage his one-act drama Henri with schoolboy players alongside Tagore's work. Among the cast of Tagore's Post Office in the Abbey here was Abbey actor and indeed matinee idol and Irish Citizens' Army activist Sean Connolly, the first rebel to die in the Easter Rising, and indeed there's a plaque for Sean Connolly outside in the foyer. And the audience included Thomas MacDonagh and Joseph Mary Plunkett, two of the organisers of the rebellion. So that must have been a heady occasion when that play was staged in this theatre. The Indian presence on an Irish stage was reciprocated 2 years later, when Tagore mounted a production of Pearse's Henri in Bengal, acted by his own schoolboy players. So Pearse's play went out to India as a reciprocal gesture. In the St. Enda's magazine on Mock Eve, Pearse recorded his pleasure at hearing Yeats speaking of, quote, Mr. Tagore's school for Indian boys as the Indian St. Enda's. Intriguingly, as James Moran has written, almost 2 years before the rebellion, Pearse also knew of the central image described in Tagore's play, the post office right here in front of your open window with the golden flag flying. It's intriguing why the post office was picked for the GPO. As someone said, it wasn't for military reasons. So theatre is in the wings from the very beginning. These cross-cultural transfers testify not only to the recurring or unhealthy, as Conor Cruise O'Brien put it, intersection between drama and politics, but also to the formative role of literary modernism in extending the global reach of the Irish Revolution. The Easter Rising is often considered as an exclusively Irish affair, a sideshow to the tragic drama of the Great War taking place on the European mainland. But as Lenin and Trotsky were among the first to recognise, it was a world historical event in its own right. So far from Ireland proving a diversion from global conflict, Britain's fateful decision to enter the Great War, as Christopher Clark suggests, may itself have been a deflection from an intractable Irish crisis and the looming threat of civil war due to Home Rule in Ireland. And that why England entered the war at that precipitous moment has been subject to much revisiting in recent years. Nor was the international fallout of the Rising confined to Europe. The Irish experience played a crucial role in the disintegration of the British Empire, writes Keith Jeffrey. And Piers Brendan, in his Decline and Fall of the British Empire, states that rather than the Rising being a mere riot, as the authorities tried to portray it, it succeeded in, as he puts it, blasting the biggest breach in the ramparts of the British Empire since Yorktown. So this brings us to the wider debates placing the Rising within cultural and historical debates. Debates on the treaty negotiations in 1921 tend to concentrate on the issues of partition and the oath of allegiance. But not enough attention has been paid to the question of dominion status, to the British fear that Ireland was the empire's weakest link, and that Irish secession would have a domino effect on the other colonies. In 1919, the British Cabinet's first report on the Irish question set its face firmly against, quote, any solution which would break up the unity of the British of the empire. But the genie was already out of the bottle. In the aftermath of the Amritsar massacre in the Punjab in India in April 1919, in which 400 civilians were murdered, the London Times declared, "There is one fact which more than any other has caused the present outbreaks in India, and possibly also in Egypt, and that is the example of Ireland." On the return of Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, the commanding officer at the massacre, to London, one MP suggested in Parliament that he should be sent to Ireland to sort out Sinn Féin. He would have had good experience. He was educated in Middleton College in County Cork. British counterinsurgency sought to refine its tactics, no doubt, not always successfully, in different theatres of war. But as Derek Sayre has suggested, the reason black and tan atrocities made such an impact on British public opinion was that their coverage, as he puts it, Derek Sayre, represented a thinly disguised discussion of the normal but usually unseen methods of colonial warfare. It's almost as the black and tans were bringing it all back home. Responding to the strong support given to Brigadier Dyer by Ulster Unionists and Tories in Parliament, the Manchester Guardian ruefully noted that Dyer's methods might come home to roost. Says the Manchester Guardian, General Dyer's more thorough supporters by no means intend to stop at India. After India, Ireland. After Ireland, British workmen on strike. Nor were Republican activists in Ireland, as we shall see later in greater detail, unaware of the wider implications of these strong-arm tactics. On hunger strike in Mountjoy in 1920, and indeed the hunger strike itself has strange affinities with Ireland and India. And it's interesting that the hunger strike comes out of two cultures, Bengal and Ireland, which had great famines. And those affinities really themselves need to be explored in further detail. But on hunger strike in Mountjoy in 1920, Frank Gallagher, one-time editor of the Irish Bulletin, wondered if the mass protests in favour of the strikers outside the prison were not playing into the government's hands. So says Gallagher, he writes this in prison. They say that the enemy government have planned our deaths, not that they may keep their prisoners in prison, but that they may get people onto the streets into position for the Amrit Tsar in Ireland. So this is the way Republicans were thinking in 1919, 1920. Such transnational awareness was central to anti-imperial attitudes in advanced Republican circles, and its neglect in recent debates on commemoration, which have limited the global or modern dimension, for the most part, to Irish participation in the Great War, needs to be redressed, which is what I'm trying to do. At stake here are perceptions of what we might call the modern and the global. For recasting the rising in these terms means retrieving it from Romantic Ireland, the mythic baggage of the Irish revival and Catholic messianism that have weighed far too heavily on previous commemorations. There is, of course, no shortage of heroism and idealism and all that to be taken into account. But these had less to do with Celtic or indeed Catholic versions of Victorian gallantry than with energies from below. The shout in the street, given modern epic expression in the pages of Ulysses. And Ulysses describes itself as the shout in the street, coming in from the wings. This clash of perspectives between, on the one hand, late Romantic sensibilities, and on the other hand, the more jarring modernist attitudes, figures prominently in contemporary critical debates about the Great War in Britain. And indeed, Fiach mentioned J. Winter. Whether, as J. Winter contends, its contemporary impact, the Great War, represented the persistence of the past in Edwardian and Georgian terms, as in much consolatory war poetry and commemorative rituals. So Winter casts the Great War in late Romantic terms. Or whether, by contrast, as Paul Fussell in this remarkable book, and indeed Samuel Hines in this other classic work, argue the Great War said goodbye to all that through the dissonance of radical modernist forms. So this debate that we need to conduct in Ireland about whether the Rising was a Romantic or a modern event is really taking place also about the Great War. What exactly are the framing perspectives for such a massive upheaval? One of the tragic paradoxes of the Great War was the rift or gap that opened up between the traumatic experiences of the battlefields and the lexicon available to describe it. It was as if trenches were cut deep into the material of language itself. As Fussell points out, the derring-do of war and the cliches of patriotism, and he lists a whole lot of these kind of catchphrases: blighty, plucky, staunch, valour, enemy foe, baptism of fire. All these, he says, were blown to pieces with the shrapnel of mechanized warfare. And the intensities of pain and suffering themselves were lost for words, cut off in a sensory no man's land. So Fussell claims it was a no man's land within the body, as well as a no man's land out there. This had to do not only with literature, but also with medical responses. Doctors and psychologists struggled to make sense of war neurosis or shell shock, leaving hospitals such as Craig Lockhart, which is now the subject of a remarkable series of fiction, Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy, and also Dublin's own Richmond War Hospital, the subject of a remarkable book by Brendan Kelly, to pick up the pieces, because the doctors were at sea as well, did not know what was happening to these damaged individuals. Outdated and precious styles of poetry, more used to escaping than confronting the intolerable, were also found seriously wanting, as writers fell back on familiar Georgian modes, like Rupert Brooke or John Masefield. As Fussell notes, finding the war indescribable in any but the available language of traditional literature. Those who recalled it had to do so in known literary terms. So they were left with this vocabulary from Georgian poetry. And he says, slightly tongue-in-cheek, Joyce, Eliot, Lawrence, Pound, Yeats were not present at the front to induct them into new idioms which might have done the job better. He writes, it would take still another war, an even worse one, before such language could force itself up from below. Modernists felt a distinct lack of sympathy, and I'm talking about Ezra Pound, Eliot, Joyce, others. Modernists felt a distinct lack of sympathy, not for the war, but for the Georgian diction of the war poets. And it was not until the war was over that the full horror began to find its way into the highly disjunctive, fragmented forms pioneered in The Wasteland and Ulysses. As Samuel Hines puts it in a remarkable, pithy formulation, The Wasteland is a poem that takes fragmentation as its formal principle, as though the visual reality of the Western Front had imposed itself on language. This is a perception the war poets never came to, and it makes Eliot's poem an expression of the war's impact on consciousness in a way that theirs wasn't, and makes it modern. So this is highly contentious stuff, to say the least, and that's why the debate precipitated by the Great War, and one would hope the Irish War of Independence, is going to open up these debates again. This deficit that Hines and Fussell talk about is also evident in diaries, journals, and letters from the front, where the stilted language and pro forma sentiments. Some of the soldiers were so inarticulate that there was pro forma postcards that they could tick off to say how they were feeling. Of course, it made the censors an easy job for the censors. But they were so shattered by what was happening, they couldn't even put it into words. But these kind of pro forma sentiments and stilted language was such as to lead Fussell. And of course, there are exceptions, and that's why these debates take place. As to lead Fussell to conclude provocatively, and this is certainly a provocative statement, that any historian would err badly who relied on letters for factual testimony about the war. It is only the ex post facto view, the retrospective view, of an action that generates coherence or makes irony possible. This is an important corrective to historical approaches that limit research exclusively to contemporary perceptions. The real tragedy of the Great War was that the present proved as enigmatic and as recalcitrant as any unforeseeable future. Now, this needs, so in a longer version of this, I tease out the implications of this. But what it involves is something that Freud and psychoanalysis and psychology were stumbling on at the exact same time. What we're dealing with here is the distinctly modern phenomenon of what Freud called belatedness, or Tragedikeit, which Freud diagnosed as the identifying characteristic of trauma. He defined it as the sense in which an experience is not fully registered at the time of its occurrence, but has to await memory, or a fraught version of modern memory, for its realization in the future. Freud said it's not just its recall in the future, it's its realization. It hasn't even taken place until it is recalled. And he said there's a radical disruption of inner life taking place. It is not just that a time lag is involved, but that certain disturbing experiences are, to a considerable degree, inchoate until they are represented. Representations, whether in poetry, fiction, film, or on the stage, do not come after the event, but are bound up with it. When Francis Ford Coppola was asked during the shooting of Apocalypse Now, what was he doing making a film about Vietnam when the war was over? Coppola said, "My film is not about Vietnam, it is Vietnam," he said. if the United States continued to fight the war out on the cinema screen. Drama was at the forefront in staging Ireland's theatres of war. Much has been made of the content of education, especially as taught by those great dramatists, the Christian Brothers, in raising national consciousness. But less attention has been paid to the form or means of instruction, to the manner in which, for example, performative elements were introduced into the classroom to give a vivid sense of participation in the making of history. And it kind of accentuates that history is made, it's not just given. In the Educational Company of Ireland's A Playbook of Irish History, every home should have one, a series of remarkable booklets written by Mary C. Houston, who I'm trying to track down who she is, probably related to Sean Houston, and illustrated by George Monks. We see history lessons improvised through drama in the classroom, in the spirit of the artisanal avant-garde of Alice Milligan. So you had a version of street theatre coming through the revival, running parallel to the Abbey Theatre, headed up by figures like Alice Milligan, who were bringing drama into the streets, into everyday life. In this makeshift modernism, for such it is, and you couldn't make it up, the Danes arrive in Ireland, and you'll read here, clad in coats of mail, and then in brackets, cardboard covered in tea paper, and sealed in ships, and then written in brackets, seats upturned, which kids would love. When the Danes take to attacking round towers, as they were wont to do, the modernist rejection of realist staging is even more striking. Now, this is Brechtian drama, albeit improvised by the brothers. A blackboard is recruited as a round tower, and you see the little heads peeking across it, the endangered monks. A blackboard is recruited as a round tower, with intriguingly a lifelike illustration on the side to make up, or I said to apologize for the poetic license. Though it might go without saying, this incongruity, the incongruity of the old and the new, the realistic and the not realistic, is precisely, this incongruity between the old and the new, is precisely the time lag or anachronism that Freud had built into the dislocations of modernity. So one theme coming through all of this is this notion of a time lag or a dislocation in time. The round tower appears to have been particularly susceptible to this, for if we remember, a specimen suddenly sprung up in the middle of Dame Street to offset pagan Trinity College during the Eucharistic Congress of 1932, at the site where King Billy's statue was not. And while this strains credulity, it is oddly consistent with the bringing of myth down to earth, which is Joyce's Ulysses, or indeed the disenchanted mythic realism or fabulism of James Stephens, Emer O'Duffy, or Flann O'Brien. This is Flann O'Brien territory. Emer O'Duffy, in one of his novels, has Conghail coming back to Dublin, but he tries to join a tennis club in Drumcondra with very bad results. And what's really happening is a whole demythologizing of the power of the myth, and yet somehow in some dialogue with it. Alice Milligan's mix of antiquity and magic lantern slides, which is what Milligan, again, pioneered, was also employed by Pearse at St. Enda's. And Pearse was into all kinds of new media. And he'd be on Twitter and whatever you're having yourself. But Pearse was avant-garde in this kind of pedagogic technology, but also in the techniques. In the production of The Boy Deeds of Conghail, Frank Dowling, as the young Satanta, is imbued with the aura of the modern photogenic face. This is coming from matinee idol stuff, as can be seen from the more muted treatment of his brother, Sean Dowling, who was not the same poster boy as Frank. And you can see how style is involved here, not just subject matter. And this is what's remarkable coming through the new work that has been done on St. Enda's. And this kind of belated modernity, the photogenic Cuchulainn, is also captured in an anecdote which recounts how, following a performance at Castle Bellingham Feis in County Louth, St. Enda's boys had to march back from Amiens Street Station in full costume, carrying battle axes and tall gilded spears which glinted like polished bronze off the lamplit streets, according to one of the participants. And the participant goes on, a crowd gathered around us, and as if fast-forwarding the centuries and making a mistake, they began to sing, "Who fears to speak of 98? They thought it was the 98 rebellion. And began surging around us. So what you have is almost 3 times superimposed on each other. Ancient Ireland, 98 rebellion, 1916. And these are the palimpsests of time, which is what Stephen Dedalus calls them, layered into our memories. And when Stephen Dedalus stands on Sandymount Strand, time is layered like laminated versions of the past in his mind. So what I'm arguing is that this kind of shifting of tectonic plates has taken place with different times intersecting each other. But it's not only time that has travelled. Distant places are also brought in to the performative ambit of St. Enda's. As Elaine Sisson suggests, a group of warriors in the grounds of St. Enda's were described by one I just used this example. This is not quite the St. Enda's boys, but again, this is Flann O'Brien material. Cuchulainn walking through the streets of red brick houses. And this kind of incongruity between the mythic and the prosaic real is part of what I'm trying to get at. But it's kind of interesting that Elaine Sisson argues that the warriors of St. Enda's, dressed up as Cuchulainn, were actually more like the Boer War than ancient Ireland. She writes, this is a first-hand account, of a group of warriors in the grounds of St. Enda's were described by one past pupil as being dressed like Boer warriors, suggesting perhaps that the styling was more influenced by contemporary events in South Africa than by Irish prehistory, or maybe it's better to say as well as Irish prehistory. Again, this is also in keeping with Freud's idea of belatedness or Tragiligkeit, except in this case, space is travelled as well as time. The best road to Tara was indeed through Holyhead, as Joyce liked to put it. It was as if Irish radicalism had to travel elsewhere to find itself at home. If the people of Ireland have a right to their country, said Patrick Ford, editor of the Irish World, the people of India have just as right a claim to theirs. If it is wrong to plunder the Irish, it is also wrong to plunder the Hindus. In his polemical tract, The Criminal History of the British Empire, and Patrick Ford was not good at understatement, first published in 1881 and reissued in 1915, ominously, Ford illustrated the civilizing mission of the British Empire to gruesome effect. So this is an illustrated catalogue of the horrors of the British Empire. And it's interesting that he shows the women and children's memorial in the Boer War at Bloemfontein. And it ends with, as he cuts it, the massacre on Bachelor's Walk. And I don't know if this is an actual photograph, but it's identical to the Amritsar photograph of the ranks of the military shooting into the civilians directly, almost like restaging the Amritsar massacre visually. Whether that's superimposed or photoshopped, hardly, I mean, is really open to debate. But what's interesting is that this awareness of distance in space as well as distance in time. It is striking that when Sinn Féin arrived on the political scene, University College Dublin students welcomed the movement on international as well as national grounds. So this is what Sinn Féin, how it was welcomed by UCD students. Hungary, Poland, Finland, a section of Russia, Ireland, India, and China have partly struck together on this policy. The Shawizi movement in India is the most recent example. our own Sinn Féin movement is therefore practically identical with the general policy which has been taken up in most countries, somewhat similar situated to us. So the irony is that even though Sinn Féin means ourselves, not actually ourselves alone, which is wrong, but even though it means ourselves, ironically this was eminently transportable. This idea of ourselves was transported across the whole imperial system. As the Irish Parliamentary Party under Redmond began to tone down its opposition to empire, and indeed rallied to the imperial flag at the outbreak of the Great War, Irish volunteer movement made it clear that hostility to enlistment was on the grounds of what they called the new imperialism. And this is their manifesto. We repudiate the claim of any man to offer up the blood and lives of the sons of Irishmen and Irishwomen in the service of the British Empire. The war, they added, is not for the cause of religion and civilization, but for the cause of England's great God, markets. So this is coming from within, and this is Irish freedom, the radical element in the volunteers. Despite the avowed principles that led thousands to enlist in defence of Little Belgium, or out of Home Rule-inspired patriotism. And indeed, we need to know more about why exactly people did enlist from the ground up, not from the top down. But the top down had very little ambivalence on this. For Redmond made no secret of the Irish investment in what he began to call our empire. So says Redmond, our representatives on the floor of the Imperial Parliament in Westminster will do everything in our power to increase the strength and the glory of what will then be our empire at long last. And by sending in support of the empire the strong arms and brave hearts of Irish soldiers and Irish sailors to maintain the traditions of Irish valour in every part of the world. The Freeman's Journal was falling over itself in agreement. Redmond's decision has vindicated the empire's share in the present Great War of Liberation. Ireland has spread its roots into the British Empire, from India in the east to Canada, from the Southern Ocean to the Northern Seas. The Irish race has had its share in the making and in defence of the colonies. And I think we need to have this in mind to realise the intensity of the rebels' break with this kind of mindset. It wasn't just about the Great War, it was about empire, it was about a bigger picture. And the intensity of the break has to be seen in that perspective. If the determination of the insurgents of 1916 is to be fully appreciated, it is against the backdrop that Home Rule, in their eyes, so far from advancing Irish independence, had become instead, as Casement put it, an imperial necessity. Says Casement, substitute India for Ireland, and it should be found that, quote, the voice of the Irish patriot was in truth a world voice, which is what Casement wanted. In the downfall of empire, says Casement, both Ireland and India shall escape from the destruction and join again the free civilizations of the earth. Well, he had to wait a long time for that. But this idea that there was a bigger picture other than the Great War, there was a world imperial system. That internationalism and the greater picture did not preclude the national, but was in fact dependent on strategic national breaches in the imperial world system, is the subject of Emer O'Duffy's remarkable novel of 1919, The Wasted Island. And indeed, one of the things that could be done in the next 5 years is to reprint all the fiction that deals with from participants in the Rising, there's a massive literary underworld that's languishing. There's no version, you will be hard pressed to find a copy of this anywhere, or indeed any of the novels that have come out. While Joyce kind of obviously looms large, there's a whole hinterland of other writers, not as great as Joyce, but as we'll see, who were part of the same life world that inspired Joyce. And O'Duffy is one of these. This novel deals with a character, Bernhard Lascelles, alias Emer O'Duffy, who travels from an airy cosmopolitanism, tinged with traits of both empire and internationalism, to involvement in the Easter Rising. So he's brought up in privileged West British Castle Catholic circumstances, and he ends up in the Rising. And this is O'Duffy's own biography. But at first he's an internationalist. Bernhard's and a socialist. Bernhard's thoughts turn to home when he recognises that even the universal requires a local habitation. Now, it's a long quote, but it's worth going through because it's the mindset that goes to the heart of this. This is in the middle of the novel. This is Bernhard thinking. A well-known proverb, which in the arrogance of his cleverness he had long despised, flashed before him, now pregnant with meaning. Charity begins at home. Slowly he began to realise the lonely ineptitude of his philosophical position, his universalism. He had feared to cut himself off from the world by serving Ireland. Now he saw that only in her service could he come into contact with the world. Alone he could achieve nothing. But with a liberated and regenerated homeland for a model, what precepts could he not demonstrate to men? Ireland as Ireland might yet have a place on the world's councils, might eventually lead them. Ireland as West Britain could have none. So this novel is it's probably the nearest thing to a kind of a psychology of how someone turned from being part of the consensus to becoming a radical in this concentrated period. Bernhard is loosely based on Duffy himself, who was brought up in a very West British Catholic family and educated at Stonyhurst before returning to medical school in Dublin, like Ernie O'Malley, another medical student. O'Duffy brought his military skills to bear with Bulmer Hobson and Ginger O'Connell on the tactical training of the volunteers. He was a military tactician. And his espousal of countryside guerrilla warfare led to a strenuous opposition to the urban strategy of the 1916 leaders. So O'Duffy was against the Rising, not because he was against violence, but because he said it is ill-conceived. It won't work. It's a staged event. So it was, in fact, O'Duffy's discovery of the plans for the Rising that alerted Owen MacNeill onto what was going on. And O'Duffy was instrumental with O'Neill in trying to call off the Rising, as was Bulmer Hobson. So actually the people who had trained the volunteers military, Ginger O'Connell now was involved in the Rising, but two of the main military tacticians were the people who were against the Rising. O'Duffy combined his military tactician and his military training with his activities as a playwright, featuring prominently in the Irish theatre company's Hardwick Street Theatre, a breakaway from the Abbey. And this was the remarkable project, led as a breakaway from the Abbey by Thomas MacDonagh, John MacDonagh, his brother, Joseph Plunkett, Edward Martin, Maureen E. Shuley, and others. And they led this breakaway from the Abbey, bringing some of the players with them. What's remarkable about their repertoire is that it decidedly rejects any kind of insular nationalism. And O'Duffy's and Plunkett's plays were staged alongside adaptations of Ibsen, Chekhov, Strindberg, others. This was a thoroughly cosmopolitan international. So we see O'Duffy's play, The Phoenix on the Roof. And we have Chekhov on the same bill on the other side. I'll just move on. You have Thomas MacDonagh's Pagans on the left-hand side, and you have O'Duffy's The Wall of Athens as a two-hander. And then when it comes to, and you have, in fact, you have Uncle Vanya, Chekhov, starring Willie Pierce. And then you have, a kind of almost prophetically, a month before the Easter Rising, Strindberg's Easter being staged, as if the whole thing is building up this kind of momentum. So that Irish Theatre of Hardwick Street is a remarkable experiment. In other words, these were not hearts with one purpose alone, single-minded, introverted nationalists. They were playing on the big stage of avant-garde European theatre. And that was what was giving them energies, as much as the inner dynamics of Irish society. What's remarkable is that after the Rising, these energies were rerouted into a new event, a new outtake from the Abbey, right here, called the Dublin Drama League, an experimental theatre founded by Lennox Robinson, who used the down nights of the theatre, maybe this is a down day of the theatre, Sunday and Monday, to stage experimental avant-garde drama here in Dublin, starting with this remarkable play, The Liberators, written by the Bulgarian Srejan Tusic about the Second Balkans War. And in fact, you'll actually see that this is Lennox Robinson's own copy, donated to the Library of the Theatre. And in fact, it's owned by an Abbey stalwart, Edith Stewart Dodd, who alternated between the Abbey and, if you like, the Dublin Drama League. So what's interesting is that the Abbey actually, this becomes an effective Peacock theatre. It's the laboratory for what's going on in the big picture. But what is remarkable is that it's utter cosmopolitanism and it's opening up of the kind of the shutters of Irish society. The key figure, along with Robinson, was Arthur Shields, veteran of the 1916 Rising. So there's Arthur Shields, in a remarkable photograph with Lennox Robinson and Sean O'Casey. I was going to say the young Sean O'Casey, but we forget that O'Casey was in his 40s when he was a young playwright. But Arthur Shields was the key figure in introducing German expressionism into Ireland, and later, as we all know, became famous on the Hollywood screen with his brother Barry Fitzgerald. So I'm just coming to a close. Though modernism is conventionally associated with the metropolitan centre as against the backward periphery, so-called, a central tenet of J. Winter's analysis of the Great War is that English culture, for one, never underwent the modernist moment fully. It was, in fact, the influx of provincials and outliers from the American Midwest, Missouri and Idaho, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, from Eastern Europe, Conrad, or indeed from Ireland, that helped to revitalize English literature in the early 20th century. Hence the image of the vortex that inspired the Vorticist movement, led by Pound, Wyndham Lewis, and others. And its manifesto was, in Pound's terminology, London is the main and vortex, drawing strength from the peripheries. So the vortex model itself, that we get energy from the peripheries. It's not that we are, the center is the innovator and then we export it out to the benighted peripheries. It's the other way around. We are drawing the energy of the peripheries to revitalize ourselves. Notwithstanding the devastation of the Great War, British social stability was never seriously in jeopardy, according to Winter. London still remaining the capital and museum of established attitudes. But of course you had these gadflies coming in, muddying the water, stirring it up, like Pound, like Eliot, like Joyce, so this argument that there's this tension between the centre and the periphery. As things fell apart in Ireland, however, it's not surprising that signature modernist devices, stylistic breakthroughs, such as interior monologue, also called stream of consciousness, and a more interesting one, free indirect discourse, where you have two voices in the one utterance, began to disrupt the time-honoured styles of Irish fiction, not least in the work of Duffy himself. And indeed, Duffy's novel comes out in 1919, even before the War of Independence. But it's interesting how, in the Wasted Island, when Bernhard is imprisoned, you began to see this kind of, Joyce had not written Ulysses at this time, but you began to see this kind of stream of consciousness technique out of a fragmented and shattered world beginning to make its impact. So, in other words, the point is Joyce wasn't the only one pushed to the limits of language, trying to make sense of what was happening. So this is Bernhard's, a description of Bernhard in prison. And again, one can imagine someone of Duffy's kind of mentality reacted to the horror of prison in this sense. His head ached excruciatingly and seemed ready to burst. And then, pitter, pitter, patter, the scurrying of little feet, rats. Instantly he was frozen with horror. His heart stood still. A cold sweat broke forth on his brow. He felt his hair standing on his scalp. Pitter, pitter, patter. Now it's not clear whether they're the sounds of the rats or his internal response to the sounds of the rats. It was somewhere in the room, looking at him. It could see in the dark. Pitter, pitter, patter. Another. How many? Frantically he realized his position, buried underground with this loathsome, pattering horror. And that would be free indirect discourse, pattering horror. That's not an objective description. That's him. That's his consciousness, disguised as an objective description. So you begin to see these stylistic techniques coming through people like Duffy in moments of intense crisis. Shudder after shudder shook his frame. This fragmentation of narrative is seen to even greater effect in prison diaries themselves and memoirs, not least Frank Gallagher's remarkable and highly experimental Days of Fear, mentioned earlier, written during the mass hunger strike in Mountjoy, April 1920. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Anne Gallagher, Frank Gallagher's daughter, is in the audience, as indeed is Sean Dowling's son in the audience, and Ernie O'Malley's son. So it's remarkable how, this kind of shadow thrown by this period, I think we still have to catch up at it in the best Freudian fashion. But Frank Gallagher's Hunger Strike was published in 1928. The style is close to delirium at times, as trains of thought oscillate between past, present, and future in a manner akin to Molly Bloom's soliloquy, including amputated phrases and the invasion of inner reveries by external sounds, imagined or otherwise. So with Molly Bloom, you don't know whether something is coming from the inside or outside, whether it's before or after. So this would be a passage in Days of Fear. The clocks, again, thank God. 1, 2, 3, 4, I missed it. But there's the Rathmines Town Hall. How long after the chime strikes? 1, 2, 3, 4, F, 3 o'clock. Oh God, I will take all the suffering of a generation on me tomorrow if I could sleep. No. Perhaps by thinking of drowsy things, bees, sunlight, tall, soft grass, they're only a shadow, softly, deepening, a shadow. Halt, who goes there? Friend. Wonder how the others are. What if some of them are already dead? Am I responsible? Men joined the strike voluntarily. So it goes on in this kind of strange kind of writing 3 years before, written 3 years before Ulysses hit the boards. What is remarkable is that for all the interior monologue, the mind does not retreat inwards, but thinks of others. Solidarity taking precedence over the self. Says Gallagher, I have my internal revolutions, a kind of personal Mexico, he calls it. Mexico is in my head. But this also applies to national identity. For on the verge of despair, Gallagher's thoughts turn to other subject peoples on the receiving end of empire. Reading Sir Harry Johnston's A History of Colonization of Africa by Alien Races, his sense of solidarity extends beyond the narrow ground of ourselves alone and places the Irish War of Independence in its wider international context. And these sessions, this is what he's writing down, impromptu. Read Harry Johnston until the light died out of the cell, felt an unspeakable pity for those rude peoples who come so suddenly under empire's harrow, the cruelty of all empires, barbarous, never-ending injustice, against which even anger is pitiable. All empires are the same, ruthless, efficient, completely soulless. If one could feel that somewhere in these dark twilight forests there was even one village where the white man would never come, so much more gentle than the coming of the pioneers of civilization, with their slave gangs and their treacheries and their trail of corpses and forced labour in mines where black men cough and die and are so easily replaced. I don't know. God seems to be very patient with the pioneers of civilization. And what's remarkable is that, is this kind of sense of humour that comes through these kind of intense texts that are almost on akin with Ernie O'Malley's writings, also coming out of these moments of crisis and extreme situations. This kind of high modernist sensibility coming out of limit situations. And I'm finishing now. Responding to Bonar Law's insistence that strikers be given no quarter and be left to die, Gallagher says, it's empire's days that are numbered. You are dealing, he writes, with the boyhood of the world, a young Ireland, a young India, a young Egypt, and perhaps even a young England. In one of the most reflective passages, Gallagher also brings up the time lag between the experience and the telling of history, noting that, quote, those who are doing battle for us outside, the waitresses and the key workers, quote, are disempowered from telling their own story until they have somehow come through their oppression. And this is, again, it's hard to imagine someone writing this in the throes of suffering. He went on hunger strike, I think, in another hunger strike for 43 days. But he writes, perhaps the people who make history never read it. Subject peoples have few historians until they are free. That is strange too. It means that until a people is freed, the class which has the leisure and the means, which writing history implies, is foreign to its own people. That the historian class is ashamed of its own people until by recognized freedom it becomes respectable. So when the people become respectable, the historians will then write about it. And you can see this feeling that history is out of sync with what's happening to us. And of course, that was the moment of transformation. In the forthcoming decade of commemorations, it could be argued that those who are not in a position to tell their own story in the past were best served not by state papers or even newspapers, but by novelists, dramatists, and poets, the surveyors of backstage society, or history in the wings. Yet in the official programme for commemoration, little or no provision appears to have been made for literary, visual, or cultural history, for the forms of memory as well as the content of memory. How events are understood, how memories are passed on, or even made in the first place. In other words, there's nothing about memory itself. There's one curatorial expert on the official committee, so far as I know, but there's almost no attention to memory itself, how the past is represented, as against the what of representation. And this is in marked contrast with the work of Fussell, J. Winter, and the powerful work that has broken through Great War commemoration. As Fussell argued, representations are bound up with the events themselves in extreme situations. But if that is so, the historical record depends on these narratives, whether in fact or fiction. So I would think we need a whole project looking at the drama as it deals with the Rising. Jim Moran has been a pioneer in that. The fictions of the Rising, the poetry of the Rising, the photography of the Rising, the material culture of this period, other than just state records, other than just the narrow ground of fact in the narrow sense. It is, as a national forum, the Abbey Theatre, in fact, is to be commended for picking up on this and for opening up this debate. And this is one of the few forums that is addressing these issues coming in from the wings, for expanding the remit of Irish theatres of war to the modern, the global, and the cultures of here and now. As a site of long-distance communication, the post office in Tagore's play was a fitting symbol of cross-cultural contact 100 years ago. And in the new communications order, it is no less pressing to devise alternative global networks and democratic forms of new media to provide small nations and peripheries with a speaking and not just a walk-on part on the world stage. So thanks very much.
Now, and we have about 5 minutes because we'll have to keep the success of last year as we kept everything on time. So we've 5 minutes, and I'm just going to ask Luke one question or provoke him one more time, and then maybe I'll take one, maximum two questions. Now, please, they're questions. I don't want statements, okay? We can have the statements over coffee. So, Luke, what struck me, and you know, because and thank you so much for the paper. It's an extraordinary paper. A paper that's kind of we didn't know what he's going to say, but it's extraordinarily inspiring and a critique as well. But it's reassuring for artists because the pressure on artists today, and we can see it, is somehow to recreate or respond immediately to history or politics, and so what's coming strong through your paper is the notion, the belated notion, and actually perhaps it might be an implicit advice to us to just take our time around how we might negotiate history and how we might just wait for that artwork, whether it's a novel, a play, or indeed a poem. So could you just kind of elaborate shortly on that in terms of the contemporary context?
Yeah, I think that probably is one of the subtexts in what I'm saying, that art and representation is not just about the past or even the present. I mean, there's pressure on playwrights and on fiction writers to respond to the present, and so there should be. But in fact, the art that's going to stand the test of time is speaking to the future. And unfortunately, very narrow criteria of what constitutes success. If there's instant take-up, how many bums on seats immediately? And the accountant's view of art is actually taking precedence over the aesthetic view of art. And indeed, it was Pound who said the artists are the antennae of the race. They're out ahead. That's why they take a hit. And the artists are ahead. And what artists are really doing, and indeed that's the question we ask ourselves, who are the cartographers of now? What playwrights, what fiction writers, what poets, what filmmakers, what visual artists are our grandchildren going to look to get the picture of our society the way Emer Duffy and the way of these other novelists back then? And I think, so this kind of notion of instant metrics and instant effect, I think has very deleterious effects, because it cramps the artist who's not responding to instant demand and instant pressure, the person who's a visionary, in other words.
And can I ask you then, in critiquing Emer Duffy's book, was that an instant reaction? And how was that, the second question, how was that received when it was published?
With great alarm. And what's remarkable is that the revisionist moment does not just occur retrospectively. Also, I mean, you had this revisionist turn, immediately the rising took place, and people of high intellectual caliber from different, layers of complexity, going back to Ernie, and then extending to Ernie O'Malley's very complicated take on the War of Independence. And so far from being a cheerleader, there was very complicated engagements. So in that sense, I think, and it probably the cultural sphere, in some sense, operates like a counter-public sphere. In other words, it should be the laboratory where things that are not official, things that are not permitted, take place. And that's what freedom of speech means. You're allowed this laboratory of the mind and the heart to work out things. They may not be practical, but that's the whole point. That it's the laboratory, as you used to say, it's the R&D, the research and development of the heart and the mind.
Okay, 2 questions. Anybody want to ask Luke a question? It's okay if you don't.
You can have target practice afterwards.
Okay, well, look, I just want to thank Luke again, and we'll move on to our next session. Good morning, Luke.
Thanks.